All right, students, welcome to 14.2.1. And we're going to talk today about strategies that each side used to try to win the Civil War. We're going to go over a few of the strategic goals that each side had, and then tomorrow we're going to talk about the 4 factors of group success. And we'll cover some of the information. Some of the information we were covering today probably is going to factor into tomorrow, so you might hear some duplication. If so, I apologize, but some of this walks hand in hand. So we're going to start off first with the Union's strategy as to how they were going to bring the South or the Confederacy back into the United States. And there's a couple different objectives that they would use in order to make sure that happened. All right, so let's look at the very first one. First and foremost, they were going to try to capture the rebel capital. And now, since they've moved it into Virginia, it was a more plausible scenario in order for them to be able to reach and capture it now. Richmond is not too far away where the Army of Potomac was at for the most of the war. Now, at the same time, it was well fortified and well protected, and when we start talking about different generals throughout the war, you'll find that some of them were pretty inept when it comes to trying to do strategy number 1. Like McClellan, he probably had enough troops throughout most of the war, at least at the opening stages of the war, that he probably could have attacked and taken Richmond a number of times. He was just too scared to do so. But one of the things is that if the capital was captured in Richmond, a number of things could have happened. First off, it's possible that there would have still been some of the political leaders in the rebel capital, and this would have allowed them to capture those who were running the rebellion. Likelihood of that, though, once an army would have to siege up on the city and then try to take it, probably would have given ample time for them to escape, but not always necessarily. If you create a big enough net around the outer rims of the city, you could prevent some escapes from happening. But if you could take off the head of the leadership, then that would probably cause the rest of the Confederacy to fall and collapse in upon itself. Second thing is, it's also a moral victory for your end, showing them that you were able to capture and take their capital. And also, it's a demoralizing thing to see your capital city fall. A lot of the time, it's very symbolic in nature to show the strength or the inability for a country to protect usually its most important city with the most important people in their country in it. So if it falls, it tends to ruin the viewpoint from the people that they have a strong government in place that is designed to protect and help them and run the war. So, strategy number 1 for the Union, try to capture the capital, Richmond. Again, does not go well for most of the war, but it's an effective strategy. Strategy number 2. This is a very important and critical one right here. You have to understand that the sheer amount of manufacturing capability of the North dwarfs that of the South. And I don't just mean kind of dwarfs it. I mean, it is truly amazing the difference between the two, because you don't just have, because we like to think about it where they have all these factories and everything, but there is a number of other things that are important. So let's kind of cover a few of them. First off, when it comes to be able to build weapons, in the North, they had a 32-to-1 manufacturing capability. That means for every one rifle that the South could make, the North could make 32 of them. You have 14-to-1 in merchant shipping, which means you have a vastly larger merchant fleet in the North that's able to trade with England or France and able to create and continue economic activity. When we look at farming, and we're not talking about cotton farming. We're talking about food production farming. They have a 3-to-1 advantage in farming acreage. So that means for every acre, the North has 3. When it comes to making wheat, one of the staples of food, they have a 412-to-1 in wheat, 2-to-1 in corn. When we're looking at manufacturing, there is 286 furnaces in the Union that make what's called pig iron. Also, you have 239 arm manufacturing in the north. Down in the south, they had all but one cannon foundry down there. North had a number of them up there. They have very few gun manufacturing areas. The South is just dwarfed by the North's ability to produce material and men. Another thing, let's just talk about people. We look at manpower in general. Population in the North is 20 million, while 20 million. The white population in the South, that is those who would be able to fight, were under 6 million. And when you look at that also from perspective, not only do you have people that can fight in the war itself, but then you also have to remember you're talking about a large slave population that needs to be kept in check too. So you can't just send everybody off to war in the South and hope that you can overwhelm and beat the North by your numbers and being able to try to raise a large army. You still have to have a group of men who stay behind and in order to protect and keep the slaves in line too. So the North has massive resources in order to actually wage this war. They have the men, they have the material, they have the machines, they have the ability to produce goods. They make most of the boots, they make most of the clothing. Yeah, while the South has cotton, it's like one thing a lot of historians say, the South quickly finds that you can't eat cotton because there's a frequent shortage of food. In the South, there's also a shortage of boots, where I think I've talked about this a few times, but as soon as if a supply train was captured, that would be a northern supply train, or if a camp was overrun, the very first thing that Confederate troops would do would be look for boots. That's what they were always trying to get their hands on. So, also, we start looking at shipping, and not just shipping, but we're talking about naval vessels too. So the North had the superior naval in every accountable element: larger ships, more ships, the ability to deploy a navy, to be able to set up a blockade. So there is a lot of different things that they were able to do successfully comparative to the South. Lastly, let's talk about the third strategy that they would have. That is control the Mississippi River. And this whole plan that the United States or the North or the Union comes up is known as the Anaconda Plan. It's just basically to squeeze the South. And this is done by a few things. Make sure that they can go ahead and blockade and set up ships so that they can't get supplies in or out. And then also take the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi River is where a lot of goods and services are coming up and down throughout the South. When we look at trains, railroads, and one thing that you'll read if you ever study the Civil War in general, you'll learn that the North has like 20,000 miles of railroad lines that they're able to use. The South has 10,000 miles, but there's also another differentiation between those rail lines and why it is important. For example, most of the northern rail lines, not all of them, but most of them run north and south. Thus meaning that the North could produce material like cannons, guns, muskets, clothing, food, and ship it down to the front lines very quickly using rail lines. The South, most of their rail lines terminated at a river point, which means that they ran east to west or west to east, and usually something would come by river. It would be deposited on a shoreline, loaded into a train, and then moved east over into the South, into the central heartland. Thus meaning if the North controls the Mississippi River, it cuts off a large number of those tributary rivers that are going into the South. The other thing is that it literally cuts the South in half, which means that the South now no longer has troops that they can pull from the west side of the Mississippi over to help the east and vice versa. Another thing is that a lot of food is grown over in the areas west of the Mississippi that the South needed for food. And even more so, their cattle was raised mainly in Texas, Oklahoma region, which means when they needed meat, it was on the other side of the Mississippi. So the North thought to themselves and made the plan. Winfield Scott actually came up with it, old Fuss and Feathers, to cut the Mississippi off from the South so they can no longer supply their army, which was a very effective strategy to use. When we get ready to talk about the Civil War, most Civil War historians, and you're probably even going to see when we talk about this war in general, they're going to focus on the Eastern Theater, and mainly it's going to be between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. That's where these big, large clashes that everybody knows about, like Antietam, Gettysburg, all those big name important battles happen in that area. However, the war itself is truly won by the North in the West. The West is where the North sees the greatest victories of most of the Civil War. And so focusing on the West is, I believe myself, is a very critical element of studying the Civil War. So if you see me occasionally talk about things that are not in your book and they focus on the Western theater, there is a reason for it, because if it comes down to the historical aspect of the Civil War, I study the West a whole lot more than the East. But the East is vitally important too. Don't let that be a distraction. All right. So you'll see some really fascinating battles on the river of the Mississippi. And the famous battle, the Monitor and the Merrimack, we all talk about the first ironclads. In all reality, ironclads were used more effectively in the Mississippi River region, and so were steamboats, than any other theater of the war. When you talk about actual naval battles or naval confrontations, most of it happens on the Mississippi River, surprisingly, comparative to the open ocean. Again, that's mainly because the South doesn't have a strong, large navy. All right, so what's this? So the keys to their victory. They have to strangle the South economically. The second thing they need to do is they need to split the South in half, prevent manpower, food, material from moving back and forth, and again, deprive the South of the men and material. Those are the strategies that they need in order to win the Civil War against the South. What does the Confederate want to do? Well, the Confederacy, they look at just fighting simply a defensive war. Their whole plan is to be able to hold their ground, hold their territory, give nothing up to the Union, do not allow the Union into their borders, and therefore they can show to the rest of the world that they are truly an independent, strong nation that can keep foreign invaders out of their territory. The only reason why the South ever moves offensively in the Civil War is to try to get European backing to their cause. Once Europe starts looking at the South and trying to consider it a free country or not, they kind of look at it and saying, well, if you can't exert power and you can't push into your enemy's doorstep, then it's just a matter of time before the North wears you down. That is the only reason why the South ever engages into offensive warfare. Warfare itself, if you ever study it, especially during these eras, you go into the 18th and 19th century, if you are a defender, you can have one man for every three that the other side needs. By that I mean the following. One man in a defensive fortified position can easily hold off three other men. And that's from a number of factors. First off, you have long-range artillery, you have effective close-range artillery, you have protection from ramparts, walls, and other material that you have to have people come across an open field to try to take. We are not talking about the modern era where you have a huge artillery piece or a bomber that you can fly over a strongly defended position and blow it apart. You have to resort to shelling, and then you have to resort to massed man attacks. And when you study the Civil War, you will read a number of these stories about large groups of men who decide that they're going to charge forward to try to take a defensive position, and thousands of them are killed on the way to the front area even before they reached the front line. There was often a maxim that if you wanted to attack a defensive position of the enemy, you should have a 5-to-1 advantage. That means 5 men for every one that the enemy has. And even then, you're going to expect to take losses of up to 2 to 3 men of those out of your 5. and to eventually be able to overwhelm the enemy's defenses and be able to breach their lines. And that is still no guarantee for victory. So the South looked at it and said, if we can just keep the North out and we can push them back out of our territory, then we will win. And eventually, when you're talking about people having to take mass loss casualties, trying to take a defensive position, eventually people grow weary of war. If you want to see a prime example of war weariness as to a country having to leave, you can look at Afghanistan when it comes to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and you can look at the United States' involvement in Vietnam. Both of them are fighting a war against a strongly entrenched enemy that was technologically inferior, yet they still had to withdraw at the end because eventually public opinion turned against the war. So that's what the South is kind of hoping for, is that the North will basically fight itself to exhaustion and finally just be like, it's just not worth the loss of life, the cost in men and material in general. We're just going to let you guys go on your way. That's kind of their idea. All right. So they're looking for a negotiated peace. That's key. One of the things, too, is in order to get into that negotiated peace, there was one thing that they also tried to do, and that was they constantly looked at capturing Washington, D.C., and Lincoln became paranoid about protecting Washington, D.C., to the point that he deprived the Union Army at times of up to 100 to 200,000 troops just to protect Washington, D.C. from a foreign invasion, troops that could have been used on the battlefield. So Lincoln himself understood the symbolic nature of Washington, D.C., and understood that if the South took it, there was very well a good chance that everybody would look at a negotiated peace. The other thing, though, that the South wanted to do is try to bring Europe into the war. That was a constant idea that they had in the back of their mind, that if they could bring Europe into the war, then they would be able to, and it's not necessarily send troops, but to economically support them and also supply military aid and support, and also thwart the Union's power on the ocean. The British at this time still have the world's strongest navy, and if the British could slash their way through the United States blockades using military power, then they'd be able to render the South with the military supplies that they would need in order to continue to hold defensively or push offensive operations. The other thing, too, is that the South needed the economics of Europe to buy their cotton in order to continue to support their economy and keep it propped up. So they knew that they needed European help on a consistent basis. There are a few moments where England itself almost entered into the war due to the Union capturing some of their merchant ships. So it almost worked for the South at some points. The other thing was, too, is to try, remember, they have a lack of manpower, and if they could get those border states to join up with them, that could double their population numbers that they needed in order to fight and continue the war. So there was constant battles within the border states to try to get them to align to the Southern cause. Remember, they still have slaveholders in those states, so there is a possibility that they could sway people towards their point. All right, this covers basic strategy of the Civil War between the two groups, what they thought they needed to do in order to obtain victory. The war itself is full of very unique battles that happen across the known United States border areas for the most part, and then deep into the South itself. And we're going to talk about some of the key battles throughout that after we go over the 4 factors of group success. I might try to bring in a few more if we have time, all right? Okay, guys, that ends this unit right here. Make sure you continue to work on your study guides, all right? And I'll see you tomorrow.